The lamp is lit, the room is warm, and there is nowhere you need to be for the next little while. So let your shoulders drop and your breathing slow, because tonight we're going to walk, very gently and without any hurry at all, through one of the most curious and beautiful lives that has ever been lived on this earth. You may know his face already, though he left us almost none of himself. Only a red chalk drawing of an old man with a long beard and heavy brows and eyes that seemed to have looked at everything in the world and found all of it worth studying. He was a painter, but he finished very few paintings. He was an engineer, but almost nothing he designed was ever built. He filled thousands of pages with the neatest, strangest handwriting, written backwards so that you must hold it to a mirror to read it, and then he left those pages scattered to the wind. His name was Leonardo, and he came from a small hill town called Vinci. And this is his whole story, told softly, from his first breath to his last, so close your eyes whenever you like, because he will still be here, moving patiently through his remarkable years, whether you are awake or drifting. He was born on the 15th of April in the year 1452, in the golden light of a Tuscan spring, in a stone farmhouse in the countryside near the little town of Vinci, which sits on the slope of a mountain called Monte Albano, about 20 miles west of the great city of Florence. We know the hour because his grandfather, a careful old man named Antonio, wrote it down in the back of an old notebook, in the plain, proud way that families kept such things. "There was born to me," he wrote, "a grandson, the son of my son, on Saturday, at the 3rd hour of the night." And the boy was baptized the following day by the parish priest, and the whole village, it seemed, came to stand at the font. 10 godparents were named, which was a great many, so that the baby who had come into the world with no clear place in it was at least well surrounded on his first full day of life. His father was a young notary named Ser Piero, a man of the town's respectable middle rank, quick, ambitious, and already climbing toward the busy legal life of the city. His mother was a young woman named Caterina, and here we come to the first quiet fact that shaped everything, because Ser Piero and Caterina were not married, and never would be. She was a local girl, perhaps a peasant, perhaps the daughter of a poor farmer from the surrounding hills, and in the same season that their son was born, his father married someone else, a girl of his own class named Albiera, 16 years old, with a proper dowry and a proper family. So the child called Leonardo began life as what that age called a natural son, born outside marriage, and this single circumstance, which might have crushed another boy, turned out instead to be a strange and lasting gift. Because he was illegitimate, he could not follow his father into the notary's guild, which was closed to men of his birth. Because he could not become a notary, no one bothered to give him the long, grinding Latin education that would have made him one. And because no one shaped him into the man he was supposed to be, he was left, to an unusual degree, free to become the man he actually was. He grew up partly in his mother's care and partly in his father's family home in Vinci, a boy of 2 households and no fixed name, and the countryside itself became his real teacher. Imagine that landscape for a moment, because he never stopped seeing it. Terraced hillsides silver with olive trees, dark rows of grapevines, the pale stone of the farmhouses, and everywhere the sound of water, streams running down from Monte Albano toward the marshy valley of the river Arno below. A boy left much to himself could wander for whole days, and this one did, watching the way a stream braided itself around a stone, the way a bird held itself motionless on the wind, the way light came green through a leaf and gold across a field in the late afternoon, and he watched all of it with a patience and a greed for detail that never left him as long as he lived. His grandfather Antonio was an old man by then, retired from whatever business he had once done, content to sit in the sun and keep his little notes, and his uncle Francesco, his father's younger brother, was that rare and useful thing, a grown man of the family who had no ambition to be anything but a countryman, tending the olives and the animals, and who seems to have loved the strange watchful child and taken him along on the slow work of the land. From these 2 quiet men, more than from his busy absent father, Leonardo learned the first lesson of his life, which was simply to look, and to keep looking at ordinary things until the ordinary thing gave up its secret. Think of what a countryside like that gives a watchful child across a single turning year, because he drank in all of it and forgot none of it. In the early spring the almond trees would flower before their leaves, a mist of white and pink against the wet grey branches, and the streams ran full and loud with the melting of the snow up on Monte Albano. And the whole valley smelled of turned earth as the men went out with their oxen to plough the terraces. In summer the light hammered down white and hard at noon, and the cicadas sang in the olives, and the boy would find the cool shade under a stone bridge, and lie there, watching how the water, brown and clear over the pebbles, curled itself into little turning wheels behind every stone. The same curling he would draw 50 years later on a page in France, having watched it, by then, for a lifetime. In autumn came the grape harvest and the olive harvest, the whole family and half the village out among the vines with baskets, the smell of the pressed grapes heavy and sweet, the great stone wheels turning to crush the olives into their green gold oil. And the boy learnt the machines of the countryside, the press and the mill and the water wheel, the simple, beautiful ways that men had found to make water and stone and wood do the heavy work of the world, and something in him, even then, wanted to know exactly how each one turned. And in winter the valley went quiet and bare, and the family drew in around the fire, and the old grandfather would tell what he knew, and the rain would come down the mountain in grey curtains, and a boy with nothing to do and everything to notice would sit at the small window and watch the drops run and gather and race one another down the glass, and wonder already why they moved the way they did. He was a boy of the seasons and the water and the light, and he never stopped being that boy, not in the great cities, not in the courts of dukes and kings, and if you want to understand the man who would one day fill thousands of pages trying to catch how the world actually moves, you must first see the child lying under the bridge, in no hurry at all, watching the little wheels of water turn behind a stone. He was, by every account, a beautiful child, with fair curling hair that he wore long all his life, and a grace of movement that people remembered, and a sweetness of nature that made him gentle where other boys were rough. Later stories, told after he was famous, said he could bend an iron horseshoe or a door knocker with his bare hands, that he was so strong he could straighten what other men could only bend, and whether or not that is true, everyone agreed that the physical beauty and the physical ease were real, and that he moved through the world as if the world were a thing to be admired rather than fought. He learned to read and write and to do his sums, but in a rough, irregular way, and he never really learned Latin as a boy, the great gate through which all serious learning passed in that century, and this shamed him a little all his life and freed him enormously, because a man who cannot read the ancient authorities is forced, instead, to go and look at the thing itself. He called himself, much later and with a certain pride that had a bruise underneath it, a man without letters, an unlettered man, and he meant that he had not been fed his knowledge from books written by dead men in a dead language, but had gone out and got it from experience, which he called the mistress of all who write well, the only teacher who never lies. There is a story told long after that catches this early gift of his, and whether it happened exactly so or grew a little in the telling, it is too fitting to leave out. A local farmer, a tenant on the family's land, had cut down a fig tree and had a rough round wooden shield, a buckler, made from the wood, and he asked Ser Piero, the notary, if his clever son might paint something on it for him. And Leonardo, still only a boy, took the crude warped shield, and first he straightened it in the fire and had a turner smooth it, and then he shut himself away, and he decided to paint upon it something that would terrify anyone who looked at it, a monster, the way the ancient shields were said to bear the head of the Gorgon that turned men to stone. So he gathered into his little room every strange and unpleasant creature he could find, lizards and crickets and serpents and bats and other crawling things, and from all of them, from the parts of each, he invented a single horrible beast, a dragon of his own making, and he painted it crawling out of a dark cleft in a rock, its breath a poisonous vapour, its eyes flaming so lifelike and so dreadful, that when at last he called his father in to see it, and had arranged the light just so upon it, Ser Piero, coming into the dim room, recoiled in genuine fright before he understood it was only paint, and the boy, delighted, said quietly that the work had achieved its purpose, since it produced exactly the effect intended, which was fear. It is the whole man in miniature, if the tale is true, the patience to straighten and smooth the wood first, the hunger to gather real creatures and study them from life, the joining of many true things into one thing that never existed, and the cool pleasure in an effect perfectly achieved. That is the boy, then, that you must hold in your mind as we begin. Illegitimate, and so free, unschooled, and so original. Left alone in a beautiful valley with running water and shifting light and a grandfather's patience, growing into a golden, gentle, watchful young man who could draw before he could properly spell, and who was already, without knowing it, gathering the raw material of the most restless mind the world would produce for a very long time. When Leonardo was around 14 or 15 years old, his father made a decision that would carry the boy out of the valley and into the current of history. Ser Piero had by then established himself firmly in Florence, one of the busy notaries whose careful contracts and wills and property deeds oiled the machinery of that rich commercial city, and he had noticed, as fathers do, that his natural son had a gift. The boy was always drawing. On any scrap of paper, on the whitewashed wall, in the dust of the road, he drew. And what he drew was good, uncommonly good, so good that Ser Piero, being a practical man who knew everyone worth knowing, gathered up some of the boy's drawings and carried them to a friend of his in the city, a painter and sculptor and goldsmith of great reputation named Andrea del Verrocchio. And Verrocchio, looking at these sheets made by a country boy with no training at all, was astonished, and asked whose work it was, and when Ser Piero told him, he agreed at once to take the boy as an apprentice into his workshop. So Leonardo came to Florence, and to understand what happened to him there, you must first understand the city, because Florence in those years was the most extraordinary place in Europe, and perhaps in the world. It was not large, a walled city of perhaps 50,000 souls, but it was on fire with money and talent and appetite. Its wealth came from wool and from silk, and above all from banking, from the great banking house of the Medici family, whose head in those years was a young man named Lorenzo, called the Magnificent, a poet and a schemer and a patron, who understood, better than any ruler of his age, that beauty was a kind of power. The whole city was a workshop. Down every narrow street came the sound of hammers and chisels and looms. To walk through it as a country boy fresh from the quiet of Vinci must have been like walking into a great warm, roaring engine of human making. There were the wool workshops where the raw fleece came in dirty and went out as fine cloth dyed in 100 colours. The streets running with the water of the dyers, the air sharp with their vats. There were the goldsmiths bent over their little flames, and the sculptors' yards white with marble dust, and the tanneries by the river, and the banks where the grave men in long robes moved sums of money across half the world with a stroke of the pen. There were the churches, dozens of them, each a treasure house of paintings and carvings and gold, and there were the great families with their fortress like palaces of rough stone. And there was, over it all, the enormous new dome, red and vast against the sky, so large that the whole valley could see it from far off, a thing that made a young man tip his head back and simply stare. And there was talk everywhere, in the squares and the shops and the taverns, quick clever Tuscan talk, about art and money and politics and the ancient Romans and the newest scandal, a city that argued and made and bought and sold and worshipped and schemed all day long, and never seemed to sleep. And into this the Golden Apprentice came, and it must have felt to him, after the hush of the olive terraces, like waking up inside a beautiful, deafening dream. The cathedral, the great church of Santa Maria del Fiore, had just been finished, crowned at last by an enormous dome of brick, the largest dome built since the ancient world, raised by a stubborn genius named Filippo Brunelleschi, who had figured out how to lift it into the air when everyone said it could not be done, and that dome stood over the city like a promise that impossible things were. In fact, possible. Into a city intoxicated with making things came the golden apprentice from Vinci, and he entered Verrocchio's workshop, which was one of the best in Florence, a place that was less like an art studio as we imagine one, and more like a small factory of the beautiful. A Florentine workshop of that kind, called a bottega, took on every sort of commission. It painted altarpieces and portraits, yes, but it also cast bronze statues, made and gilded picture frames, designed festival costumes and banners and parade armour, sculpted marble tombs, worked gold and silver into jewellery, and engineered the great machines and pageant floats for the city's holidays. An apprentice began at the bottom, grinding the pigments, boiling the glues, sweeping the floor, preparing the wooden panels with layer after layer of smooth white ground, and only slowly, over years, was he allowed to touch the master's work, first painting a bit of drapery, then a background, then perhaps a minor figure, until at last, if he had it in him, he could be trusted with a face. Leonardo had it in him. He learned everything the shop could teach, and he learnt it with the omnivorous hunger that marked him always, but it was not only painting he learnt there. Verrocchio was a sculptor and a metal worker, and something of an engineer, and his boys learned to understand how a thing was built, how weight was carried, how bronze was poured, how a machine turned force into motion, and Leonardo, watching all of this, began to knit together in his mind the thing that would make him unlike any other artist, the conviction that painting and sculpture and engineering and anatomy and the study of water and light and the flight of birds were not separate subjects at all, but one great connected subject. The study of how the world actually works. There is a famous story from these apprentice years, and though it may have grown in the telling, it points at something true. Verrocchio was painting a picture of the baptism of Christ, and he set his gifted young apprentice to paint one of the two kneeling angels at the side. And Leonardo painted his angel, a soft, luminous, half-turning figure with hair like curling water, and he painted it with a delicacy of shading, a softness where light melted into shadow that was simply beyond what his master could do. And the story goes that Verrocchio, looking at the boy's angel beside his own stiffer work, was so struck, and perhaps so quietly wounded, that he resolved never to touch a paintbrush again, and to leave painting henceforth to his pupil. Whether or not he truly threw down his brush forever, the picture survives, and the angel is there, and anyone can see, even now, that a new kind of seeing had come into the world in the corner of that panel. There is another picture from these workshop years that shows the same new eye at work, a small painting of the angel of the Annunciation coming to the young woman with the news that she will bear a child, and Leonardo, or Leonardo more than any other hand in it, set the scene in a walled garden before a distant misty landscape, and painted the angel's wings not as the flat gold feathers of tradition, but as the real wings of a real bird, studied from life, and laid the meadow at their feet thick with flowers, each one botanically true, each blossom a thing he had actually knelt down and looked at, so that even in a scene of the holy and the miraculous, the grass was real grass, and the wings were real wings, because he could not, even then, paint a thing he had not first truly seen. That was the deepest revolution in him, deeper than any single trick of the brush, the refusal to paint from other paintings, the insistence on going always back to the living world and copying that. What was new was the softness. Painters before Leonardo drew a clear hard line around things, and filled the line with colour, so that a painted person looked a little like a beautiful map of a person, every edge sharp. But Leonardo had spent his boyhood watching how things actually appear to the eye, and he had noticed that in life there are almost no hard edges, that a cheek turns into shadow by 1,000 invisible steps, that the air itself, full of moisture and dust, softens everything in the distance to blue and grey. So he began to paint the way the eye truly sees, letting his forms emerge from darkness through infinitely gentle gradations of light, blurring the very edges of things into a soft smoke, a technique the Italians named for him, with a word that means exactly that, smoke, a way of modelling that makes his figures seem not painted onto a surface, but breathing within a real and misty air. He was made a master in his own right, admitted to the Painters' Guild of Florence, the Guild of St. Luke, when he was around 20 years old, which meant he could now take commissions of his own, and yet he chose to stay on in Verrocchio's workshop for several more years, comfortable, learning, in no hurry, and here we meet another of the great themes of his life, which is that he was almost never in a hurry and almost never finished anything. His mind moved faster than his hands could follow, and long before a picture was done, a new problem, a better idea, a deeper question would rise up and pull him away, so that the studios of Italy would one day be full of his beginnings, magnificent unfinished things that other, lesser, more dogged men could only stand before and envy. In these Florentine years, the great current of his curiosity was already running in every direction at once. He studied the human body, drawing it over and over. He studied machines, sketching gears and pulleys and screws. He studied plants and the folds of cloth, laying real linen dipped in wet clay to hold its shape, and drawing the play of light across every fold with a patience that must be seen to be believed. He carried always a little notebook hanging from his belt, and into it went everything: a face glimpsed in the street, the design of a hoist, a joke, a shopping list, a sudden thought about the moon, all jumbled together in that strange left-handed mirror writing that ran from right to left across the page, so that some later people thought it a secret code, though it was really just the natural, easy way for a left-handed man to write without smearing the ink. A small private habit that happened also to keep his thoughts a little to himself. Around this time there came a shadow, and because we are telling the whole life, and not only the shining parts, we must let it pass through. Gently, when Leonardo was 24, an anonymous accusation was dropped into one of the boxes that the city kept for citizens to report wrongdoing, naming him and several other young men in a charge of immoral conduct. Such anonymous charges were common, and often malicious, and this one named a young man of a powerful family among the accused, which may be why it was quietly dropped. The case dismissed twice for lack of any witness willing to come forward, and the whole matter allowed to fade. But it must have frightened him, a young man at the beginning of everything, and some who study his life believe that the intense privacy he wore ever after, the guardedness under all that golden charm, the mirror writing, the way he kept the deepest chambers of himself locked even to close friends, may have hardened partly in the cold of that season. He never married, and he never, as far as anyone knows, formed the ordinary family that most men build, and he seems to have loved beauty in the male form and drawn it with tenderness all his life, and beyond that we should not pry, because he did not invite the world in, and there is a kind of respect in letting a man keep the door he chose to keep. What we can say is that he came out of his 20s as a fully formed master with a growing reputation, and with the first great commissions of his own beginning to arrive. One was an altarpiece of the Adoration of the Magi, the wise men kneeling before the infant Christ, and he threw himself into it with tremendous energy, making study after study. And he began it on the great panel with a swirling, agitated, revolutionary composition, unlike anything anyone had attempted. A crowd of figures wheeling around the still centre of mother and child, rearing horses in the background, faces lifted in wonder and in fear, and then, with the whole thing sketched in brown across the wood, alive and unfinished and full of a terrible beauty. He simply stopped, and walked away, and never touched it again, and it stands to this day exactly as he left it. A ghost of a masterpiece. The most eloquent unfinished picture ever made, because he had received, or gone looking for, a chance to leave Florence entirely and begin his life again in another city, in another world, in the service of another kind of master. The reason he left is itself revealing. Lorenzo the Magnificent, the ruler of Florence, was sending some of the city's finest artists as a kind of gift and a kind of diplomacy to other Italian courts. And yet Leonardo does not seem to have been among the favoured ones sent by the great man. He was, perhaps, too odd, too slow, too unwilling to finish, not quite the safe, reliable talent a ruler likes to give away as a present. So Leonardo, around the age of 30, made his own arrangements, and he did a very characteristic thing. He wrote a letter of application to the ruler of the northern city of Milan, a powerful, dangerous, luxurious man named Ludovico Sforza, and in that letter we see the whole strange shape of Leonardo's ambition laid bare. He did not write to Ludovico as a painter, he wrote to him as an engineer. Across most of a long letter he described, point by point, the marvels he could build for a warlord. He could make bridges that were light and strong and easy to carry. He could drain the water from the moats of a besieged city. He could build cannon and mortars and catapults of beautiful and unusual design. He could construct covered chariots, safe and unassailable, that would break through the thickest ranks of the enemy. The ancestor, if you like, of the armoured tank, dreamed up 450 years before its time. He could make ships that resisted the heaviest fire, and secret winding underground passages, and engines of war of every kind. Only at the very end, almost as an afterthought, in a single modest closing line, did he mention that in time of peace he believed he could give as complete satisfaction as any other in architecture, and in the construction of buildings, and that he could also paint, in oil or in marble or in bronze, whatever might be required, and that furthermore he could undertake the great bronze horse that Ludovico wished to raise in eternal memory of his father. That is the man offering to build tanks, and by the way mentioning that he can also paint. And it worked. Around the year 1482, Leonardo left Florence and crossed the mountains to Milan, and he would stay there in the service of the Sforza court for the better part of 17 years, the longest settled period of his whole roaming life, and the years in which he made some of the works that would carry his name down the centuries. Before we cross the mountains with him, sit a moment longer with that letter he wrote to the ruler of Milan, because it is one of the strangest and most revealing documents of his whole life, and it tells you exactly how he saw himself, or how he wished to be seen, at the beginning of his real career. Here was a man the world would remember as the supreme painter of his age, and when he needed to sell himself to a powerful prince, he did not lead with painting at all. He led with war. 10 numbered promises, one after another, of the terrible engines he could build. Portable bridges to chase a fleeing enemy or escape a pursuing one, ways to drain the water from the ditches of a besieged town, ways to shatter any fortress not built on solid rock, cannon that flung small stones almost like a storm of hail, secret tunnels dug under rivers, covered wagons armoured against all attack that could roll into the thickest enemy and break them open for the foot soldiers following behind, catapults and mangonels and other engines of wonderful power, and for a fight at sea, ships that could withstand the heaviest bombardment. Only after all of that, only in the 10th and final point, almost shyly, did he add that in peacetime he thought he could satisfy anyone at all in architecture, in the building of public and private works, and in the guiding of water from one place to another, and that as for painting and sculpture, he could do as well as any man living, whoever he might be. It is the letter of a man who has understood something cold and true about the world he lives in, that in an age of endless war among the Italian states, a prince will pay far more for a mind that can win him a battle than for one that can paint him a saint, and so the greatest painter alive offered himself, first and loudest, as a maker of the machinery of death, and slipped his genius for beauty in at the very bottom of the list, as a kind of afterthought. And whether Ludovico ever read the whole thing, or believed half of it, he took the man, and Leonardo went north to build his tanks and his cannon, and ended up instead painting a supper that would outlast every empire of his age. Milan was a different world from Florence. Florence was a republic proud and quarrelsome and intellectual, a city of merchants who governed themselves. Milan was a duchy, a state ruled by one strong hand, richer in a coarser way, closer to the courts of France and to the wars that would soon come pouring down over Italy. Ludovico Sforza was not the rightful duke. That was his young nephew, but Ludovico held the real power and would soon hold the title too, and he ruled with cunning and splendour, filling his castle with artists and musicians and scholars and beautiful things, spending money like water to make his court the wonder of Italy. And Leonardo, who could do anything, became the great ornament of that court. He designed the pageants and the masks, the fantastical spectacles with which a Renaissance prince amazed his guests, and by every account these were dazzling, machines that made a mountain open to reveal the planets turning, a mechanical lion, and clouds of costumed figures, and no one who saw them ever forgot them, though of course. Being made of paper and cloth and cleverness for a single night, not one of them survives. He served as a kind of all-purpose genius, consulted on the plumbing of the castle and the fortifications of the walls and the tiling of a dome, playing music, for he was a fine musician and a witty companion, telling riddles, and he began, at last, the two great projects that would consume much of his Milanese years. It is worth lingering on the pageants for a moment, because they are the most completely lost of all his works, gone as utterly as smoke, and yet in their own day they may have brought him more fame and more delight than anything he painted. A Renaissance prince ruled partly by spectacle, by overwhelming his guests and his rivals with displays of wealth and wonder, and Leonardo became the great master of these displays, the man who could make the impossible seem to happen before your eyes. For one great festival, a celebration held in the castle, he built a vast machine that showed the heavens themselves, a half-dome of gilded stars with the planets moving in their courses, and the signs of the sky turning, and at the climax the great vault opened, and figures representing the planets came forward to sing and recite, all of it lit by hidden lamps so that the whole thing seemed to glow from within like the true night sky brought down into a room. He built a mechanical lion, it is said, that could walk forward on its own, and then open its breast to reveal a shower of lilies, a marvel of hidden gears and springs, the flowers being the emblem of France, made to honour a French king. He designed costumes and floats and revolving stages and clouds full of angels lowered on unseen wires, and men who saw these things wrote of them ever after as the most beautiful spectacles of the age, and not one scrap of any of it survives. Not a lamp, not a gear, not a lily, because it was all made of paper and cloth and cleverness for a single golden night. And when the night was over, the wonder was struck and stored and forgotten, and only a few sketches in the notebooks and a few astonished words in old letters remain to tell us that the greatest mind in Italy once spent his gifts, gladly, on things designed to last a single evening and then vanish. There is something in that too that is deeply him, a man who did not mind, or minded less than we would, whether a thing endured, so long as it had once been perfectly, briefly real. The first was the horse. Ludovico wanted an enormous bronze equestrian statue of his father, Francesco Sforza, the soldier of fortune who had seized the duchy by force of arms, a monument to found a dynasty. And Leonardo, who loved horses above almost any other creature, and filled page after page with studies of their muscles and their movement and their proud, beautiful heads, conceived a statue larger than any that had ever been cast, a bronze horse over 20 feet high. He laboured over it for years, dissecting the anatomy of horses, drawing, calculating, and at last he built a full-sized model of the horse in clay, and when the people of Milan saw it, this colossal clay horse standing in a courtyard, they were stunned. They thought it the greatest thing of its kind ever made, greater than the ancient world had left. But to cast it in bronze he needed metal, an enormous quantity of bronze, perhaps 70 tons of it, and he wrestled with the terrible technical problem of how to pour so much molten metal into so vast a mould without it cracking or cooling wrong, and he was still wrestling with it, still perfecting it, still not quite finished, when history reached out and destroyed the whole dream. The wars had come. A French army poured into Italy, and Ludovico, frightened and desperate, needed his bronze not for a horse but for cannon, and the metal that was to have made the greatest statue in the world was carted away to be melted into guns. And later, when the French finally took Milan, the great clay horse, the model Leonardo had laboured over for so many years, was used by Gascon archers as a target for their crossbows, and stood out in the weather, shot full of holes, until the rain dissolved it back into the earth it was made of. 16 years of work, and the most magnificent thing, and nothing left of it but drawings and a hole in Leonardo's heart that you can feel in his notes for years after, where he writes, once with a plainness that is almost unbearable, of the horse, and says no more. There was another picture from the Milan years too. One that did survive, an altar piece of the Virgin with the infant Christ and a young St. John and an angel, all set not in a golden heaven, but in a strange and wonderful grotto, a cave of dark rocks and shadowed water, with mysterious blue distances glimpsed through the openings, and every plant and stone rendered with a naturalist's exactness, so that the Holy Family seems to kneel in a real damp cavern at the edge of the world, half in shadow, half in a soft mysterious light, the whole picture breathing that smoky dusk he loved. He quarrelled bitterly with the men who commissioned it over money, over how much the work was worth, a long dreary business of contracts and complaints that dragged on for years and ended with 2 versions of the picture being painted, and it is a reminder that even for the greatest genius of the age, the ordinary grinding troubles of getting paid never went away, that he had a household to feed and pupils to keep, and had to haggle over his fee like any other tradesman, and did not always haggle well, being a dreamer with an empty purse more often than a rich man. But the picture endured, and you can see in it, in that shadowed holy cave, the same eye that watched the water under the bridge, in love with rock and plant and mist, and the falling of light into darkness, painting the Mother of God as if she knelt in a real cave in a real Tuscan hillside, because for him there was no seam between the holy and the natural, the divine was in the true rendering of a leaf. But the other great work of the Milanese years survived, though only barely, and it is one of the most famous images ever made by human hands. The prior of a Dominican monastery in Milan, the convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie, wanted a painting of the Last Supper of Christ for the end wall of the room where the monks ate their meals, the refectory, so that the brothers sitting at their own long tables would seem to share the room with Christ and his apostles at theirs. And Leonardo took the most familiar scene in all of Christian art, a scene painted 1,000 times before, and he did something no one had ever done. Instead of the calm, frozen, holy tableau other painters made, he chose the single most human and dramatic instant of the whole story, the moment just after Christ has said, quietly, "One of you will betray me," and he painted the explosion of that sentence through 12 men. He painted the shock of it, the disbelief, the sorrow, the men leaning and recoiling and turning to one another, one gripping a knife, one throwing up his hands, one leaning back in horror, each of the 12 reacting according to his own nature, so that the picture is not a scene but a storm of the soul, all of it radiating out from the still, sad, accepting figure of Christ at the centre, his hands open on the table, the calm eye of the human hurricane around him. It was a revolution in what a painting could do, a picture that captured not a pose but a moment in time, not bodies but minds. And yet even here, even in triumph, we meet the shadow that followed everything Leonardo made because of the way he chose to paint it. A wall painting, a fresco, was normally made by painting swiftly onto wet fresh plaster, so that the colour soaked into the wall and became part of it forever, but wet plaster dries fast and forces the painter to work quickly, in a day, in a rush, and Leonardo could not work that way. He needed to brood over a face for weeks, to come back and change a curve of a lip, to leave a section and return, to work at the slow, simmering pace of his own deep mind. There is a wonderful account from a man who watched him at it, who described how Leonardo would come to the convent early, climb up onto the scaffold, and paint from dawn to dark without once remembering to eat or drink, so lost in the work, and then how he would go for 2, 3, 4 days and not touch the picture at all, only come and stand before it for an hour, arms folded, studying, judging his own work in silence, and then leave. And once, the writer says, in the middle of a busy afternoon, Leonardo hurried across the whole city from a job he was doing elsewhere, climbed the scaffold, took up a brush, made 2 small strokes on a single figure, and climbed down and left, satisfied, the 2 strokes being all that the whole day's thought had earned. To paint like that, he could not use the swift, honest method of fresco. So he invented his own method, painting on the drywall in oils and other mixtures, a technique that let him work slowly and softly and endlessly, and it was beautiful. And it was a disaster, because the paint did not bind properly to the plaster, and within a very few years, even in Leonardo's own lifetime, the great Last Supper began to flake and fade and fall from the wall, and it has been dying, and being rescued and dying again for 500 years, a masterpiece that was ruined almost as soon as it was made, so that what the world reveres is in truth the ghost of what he actually painted, the faint surviving stain of one of the greatest things ever conceived. There is a lesson in it, if you want one, though he would probably have shrugged, because for Leonardo the thinking was always more real than the finishing, the problem more precious than the solution, and a picture in his mind, perfect and complete, was somehow more true to him than the imperfect flaking thing on the wall. Through all these Milan years, the painting and the horse and the pageants were only the visible tip of him. Underneath, in the notebooks, the real work went on, the ceaseless private investigation of everything. He studied water, how it moves, how it swirls and eddies and falls, drawing the curling patterns of a stream around an obstacle with a truth that scientists would not match for centuries. He studied the flight of birds, watching how a bird tilts a wing to turn, how it rides the rising air, and he designed flying machines, great winged contraptions a man might strap on and flap, and though none of them could ever have flown, because no human muscle is strong enough, the studies of flight themselves were centuries ahead of anyone. He studied light and shadow and the eye and how we see. He studied the growth of plants, and why the branches of a tree, added together, equal the thickness of the trunk. He studied the movement of the planets, the nature of fossils found high in the mountains, which told him, correctly and heretically, that those mountains had once been under the sea. He drew up plans for an ideal city, with clean streets on 2 levels, the traffic and the filth below, the people and the light above. A city designed to be healthy in an age when plague swept through the crowded towns and killed 1/3 of everyone. He had lived through such a plague in Milan, watched the dying carted through the narrow filthy streets, and where other men saw the hand of God or the wrath of fate, he saw, characteristically, a problem to be solved. And he reasoned that the sickness bred in the crowding and the filth and the foul water and the dark, and so he designed a city to defeat it, wide and open and clean, with running water piped to carry away the waste, with a lower level for the carts and the animals and the dirty work, and the upper level, up in the light and the air, for the people to walk and live, with gardens and space and the sun let in, a city planned not for the glory of a prince, but for the health of the ordinary people who lived in it, which was an idea so far ahead of its time that it would be 400 years before cities truly began to be built with such things in mind. Of course no one built his city. Princes did not commission clean water for the poor, but he drew it anyway, in his notebooks, for no one, because the thinking itself was the thing, and because a mind like his could not look at suffering without at once beginning to design its remedy, whether or not the world would ever let the remedy be built. He designed machines without end, machines to spin thread, to polish mirrors, to lift water, to move armies, a machine gun of many barrels, a diving suit, a parachute, a mechanical knight that could sit and move its arms. Almost none of it was built. Almost none of it was even shown to anyone. It went into the notebooks, into that beautiful backward hand, and the notebooks went into a chest, and the world would not learn most of what had been in that astonishing skull until centuries after it had turned to dust. He was, in the deepest way, a man out of his time, a mind of the future somehow born too early, working alone in the lamplight of a Milanese studio, asking questions that no one around him even knew were questions. And then it ended, as so much in his life ended, not by his own choosing, but by the blind blundering of the wider world. The French came, and Milan fell, and Leonardo's patron Ludovico Sforza, the splendid schemer, was betrayed and captured and carried off to a French prison, where he would die, and the court that had been Leonardo's home for 17 years dissolved like one of his own pageants at the coming of morning. Leonardo, now in his late 40s, an age when most men of that century were old, gathered up his notebooks and his few pupils, among them a young man he had taken into his household, a boy of great beauty and great mischief whom he had nicknamed the Little Devil, and who stole from him and lied to him, and whom he loved and kept beside him for the rest of his life anyway, and he went out again onto the roads of Italy. A wanderer once more, his greatest works behind him ruined or destroyed, uncertain, at 50, where his home would be. He went back, for a time, to Florence, the city of his youth, and he found it changed, and himself a returning celebrity, the great master come home, and the young painters of the new generation studied his every move. There was a young man there, hot-tempered and mighty, a sculptor of terrifying power named Michelangelo, more than 20 years younger, who did not like Leonardo, thought him a dabbler who never finished anything, mocked his failed horse to his face in the street, and the two greatest artists of the age circled each other with a cold rivalry, so different in every way. Leonardo old and gracious and gentle and unfinished. Michelangelo young and rough and furious and relentless. They were opposites in almost everything, and the difference is worth pausing on, because it tells you what kind of man Leonardo was by showing you the man he was not. Michelangelo was pious and tormented and solitary in his grief, a man who wore the same boots until they had to be cut from his feet, who cared nothing for fine clothes or music or company, who saw art as a kind of holy suffering and hurled himself at the marble as if wrestling an angel. Leonardo was elegant and serene and social, beautifully dressed, sweet-mannered, a lover of music and animals and good talk, a man who could not bear the ugliness of unfinished suffering, and sought always the calm, the balanced, the harmonious. One tried to tear the figure violently out of the stone. The other tried to let the figure emerge softly out of the mist. And there is a story, whether true or not it is often told, that once in a public square in Florence, some men called Leonardo over to settle a difficult passage in a poet's verse. And just then Michelangelo was passing, and Leonardo, courteous as ever, said that surely the young sculptor there could explain it better than he, and Michelangelo, hearing a slight in the politeness, turned on him with sudden fury and threw the failed horse in his face, sneered that Leonardo had made a model of a horse and could not even cast it in bronze, and had been abandoned in his shame by the fools of Milan who trusted him, and stalked off, leaving the older man standing red-faced and silent in the street, too gentle or too proud to answer. Whatever the exact words, the two of them did not love each other, and yet the city, seeing what it had, set them against each other, commissioning each to paint a great battle scene on the walls of the same enormous hall, a contest of the Titans that all Florence waited to see. And of course, this being Leonardo, it came to nothing. He began his battle scene, a wild swirling knot of horsemen and soldiers fighting for a flag, the most violent and passionate thing he ever designed, a study of the bestial rage of war by the gentlest of men, and once again he could not resist experimenting with his materials, tried some new mixture of oils and heat to make the colours richer, and once again it failed, the paint ran and would not dry, and the great wall picture was abandoned, half done, and later painted over and lost, and survives only in the copies that other artists made of the terrifying central knot before it vanished, the fighting men and screaming horses that even in a copy make your blood run cold. But it was in these years, in the shifting, unsettled middle of his life, that he painted the picture that would in the end outshine all the others, the small, quiet portrait of a woman, a Florentine merchant's wife, that we call the Mona Lisa. He seems to have begun it around the year 1503, a portrait of a young woman named Lisa, the wife of a silk merchant, seated calmly with her hands folded, a soft, mysterious, not quite smile on her lips, before a strange, dreamlike landscape of winding roads and misty mountains and water. It should have been a routine commission, a wife's portrait for a merchant's wall, and instead it became the obsession of his life. He never delivered it. He carried it with him, this small panel, for the rest of his days, from Florence to Milan to Rome to France, working on it, layering the soft smoky shadows one over another over years, until the flesh seemed to breathe and the smile seemed to change as you looked at it, appearing and vanishing, warm and sad and knowing all at once, so that people have stood before it for 5 centuries trying to say what she is thinking, and no one ever quite can. Which is exactly the point, because he had painted, not a face, but the living mystery of a mind behind a face, the thing we can never fully read in any human being we love. It is the most famous painting in the world, and it never left his side while he lived, and there is something almost unbearably tender in the thought of the old man carrying that young woman's smile with him from country to country, still not finished, still not willing to let her go. In these same years he went on with the science, deeper and darker and more astonishing than ever. And now he did the thing that even his own age found hard to forgive. He went into the rooms of the dead. He got permission at a hospital in Florence and later elsewhere to dissect human bodies, and over his life he opened perhaps 30 of them, working often at night, by candlelight, alone with a corpse and a knife and his notebooks, in the cold, holding down his own natural horror in the service of his terrible curiosity, and he drew what he found with a truth and beauty that anatomists would not surpass for hundreds of years. He drew the bones, the muscles, the nerves, the tangled vessels of the heart, the layers of the brain, the curled unborn child in the opened womb, drawing the child in its mother's body with such tenderness and wonder that it stops your breath, this old solitary man, alone at midnight with the dead, drawing the very beginning of life. He understood things no one would understand again for centuries. He saw that the heart was a muscle and how its valves worked, and he made a glass model of an aorta and pumped water through it to watch the eddies, and he was right about the eddies in a way that was only proven in our own age with modern machines. He meant to publish it all, a great book on the anatomy of man, and he never did, and the drawings went into the chest with everything else. And medicine limped along in ignorance for centuries over questions this one man had already answered and locked away. Between Florence and Rome there were other stations of the wandering, and one of them showed a wholly different Leonardo, the practical man of war he had always claimed to be in that old letter. For a season he took service with one of the most feared and ruthless men in all Italy, a young warlord who was carving himself a state by treachery and force through the middle of the country, and Leonardo became his military engineer, riding across the war-torn hills, inspecting fortresses, advising on their defence, and drawing as he went. The most beautiful and accurate maps anyone had yet made, town plans seen as if from a bird high above, drawn to true scale, the rivers and roads and walls laid down with a clarity that would not be matched for generations, so that even in the service of a tyrant, even amid the burning of towns, the eye went on doing its patient truthful work, mapping the world exactly as it was. He did not stay long in that grim employment, and the warlord himself was soon dead, betrayed as he had betrayed others, and Leonardo went on, older, quieter, carrying his maps and his notebooks and his growing certainty that men were, as he wrote once in a dark mood, a race of beasts who would fill the earth with their slaughters, a strange and sorrowing judgment from so gentle a soul, earned. Perhaps, in exactly those months of riding through the wreckage that ambitious men made of the beautiful country he loved. Now the wandering entered its final phase. He went to Rome for a while, in the years when the great popes were rebuilding the city in marble, and other artists thrived there. His old rival Michelangelo up on the scaffold of the Sistine Chapel, painting the ceiling that would astound the world, and the young golden Raphael filling the papal rooms with grace. But Leonardo, old now and famous and strange, found little favour, was given little to do, and spent his time on his experiments, on optics and mirrors and a curious study of the reflected light of the moon. And on breeding, it is said, some lizard into a little dragon with wings and horns of quicksilver to frighten his visitors, an old genius amusing himself, out of fashion, in the shadow of younger men. He was watched with suspicion in Rome, for his nighttime work with the dead had reached the ears of the pious, and there were whispers that his dissections were something unholy, and permission to open bodies was taken from him, and he felt, in that city of soaring new glory, oddly sidelined, a great tide going out and leaving him on the sand. He complained a little, in his careful way, in his notes, of assistants who cheated him, and of small men who thwarted him. The ordinary bruises of an aging man watching a younger generation take the prizes, and one feels for him, the greatest of them all, sitting apart with his mirrors and his moon and his little quicksilver dragon, no longer quite in fashion, waiting, though he did not know it, for the one last patron who would understand exactly what he was. And then, at last, in the final act, came a patron worthy of him, and a home. The young king of France, Francis I, a giant of a man, generous and brilliant and hungry for the glory of Italy, had come to know Leonardo, and he wanted him, not for a horse or a wall or a war machine, but simply to have him, to possess the greatest mind in the world and keep it near, to sit and talk with it. So Francis brought the old man to France, and gave him a beautiful small manor house called Clou, near the royal castle at Amboise in the green valley of the Loire, and gave him a generous pension, and asked of him almost nothing, only his company and his conversation, and there. In the last 3 years of his life, Leonardo found at long last the peace he had never quite had. He crossed the Alps for the last time, an old man on a mule, carrying with him his notebooks, his pupils, and 3 paintings he could not part with, among them the smiling woman, and he settled into the manor house with its garden and its stream, and the young king came to visit him. It was said through a tunnel that connected the castle to the manor, and would sit for hours listening to the old man talk of everything under the sun, and later said that he did not believe any other man had ever been born who knew as much as Leonardo, and that the loss of him was a loss to all mankind. His right hand had grown weak by then, some say from a stroke, and he could no longer paint much, though he could still draw and still think, and he organised his mountains of notes, and designed a great festival for the king, and drew, near the end, a series of dark visions of the world dissolving in flood and storm. Immense deluges of falling water sweeping everything away, whether from some private dread or only from his lifelong obsession with thee. Movement of water, no one can say. And near the very end, when the hand could barely hold the chalk, he drew those strange dark visions of the end of the world, a whole series of them, immense storms of water falling upon the mountains and the towns, great curling avalanches of floods sweeping away trees and rocks and the works of men, whole cities dissolving beneath the churning deluge. Drawn with the same loving exactness he had once given to the little wheels of water behind a stone in a boyhood stream, only now the water was the whole ocean falling on the world, calm and total and without mercy, and around the drawings he wrote of how the flood would come and what it would carry away, and no one can say for certain whether these were the private dreads of a dying man, or a scientist's cold study of the greatest force he knew, or something of both, a lifelong lover of water at last drawing water as the thing that ends all things, the tide come in over everything, and there is a terrible calm in them, no panic, no cry, only the patient recording eye watching the world go under, the way it had watched everything else, to the very last, without flinching. He grew ill in the spring of 1519. He made his will careful and generous, leaving his precious notebooks to his most faithful pupil, remembering his servants, remembering even his difficult loved little devil, arranging for masses to be said and candles to be carried at his funeral, an old man setting his house in order with the same care he had brought to everything. And on the 2nd of May in the year 1519, at the manor house of Clou, in the valley of the Loire, in the country of France, Leonardo of Vinci died, 67 years old, the peasant's son who had become the wonder of the world. It is said that in his last days he grew gentle and thoughtful about the account of his own life, and that he told those around him he had offended God and mankind in not having worked at his art as he should have done, which is a strange and touching thing for the greatest artist of his age to have said, and shows you how high his own standard had been, how far even his mountains of achievement fell short of the perfect thing he had always seen in his mind and never quite been able to set down, so that this man whom the whole world called a god of art died believing, in some corner of himself, that he had not done enough. But he made his peace and received the rights of the church he had questioned all his life but never quite left, and composed himself to die with the same dignity he had brought to everything. There is a beautiful legend, told first by a writer who loved him, that he died in the arms of the king himself, the great Francis cradling the old man's head as he passed. And scholars tell us this cannot quite be true, that the king was elsewhere that day, but the legend endured because it felt right, because it said something true about what he had become, that a king would want to hold that head as it died. And perhaps that is the fairest measure of the whole life, that when men came to imagine his death, the picture that seemed right to them, the picture that felt true even though it was not, was of the most powerful king in Europe setting aside his crown for an hour to hold in his own arms the dying son of a peasant girl from a hill town, because the peasant girl's son had turned out to be the more precious of the two, the rarer thing, the one the world could not replace, and everyone, even a king, somehow knew it. He was buried in the church of the castle at Amboise, and in the centuries of war and ruin that followed, the church was damaged and the graves disturbed, and his exact bones were lost, so that we do not truly know today which handful of dust in that ground was once the skull that held that universe. There is a strange fitting rightness even in that the man who left almost nothing finished and whole should leave, in the end, not even a certain grave, no marble tomb like the ones he had carved for other lesser men, only a lost stone in a broken church in a foreign land, his bones mingled with others, unmarked, uncertain, so that we cannot point and say, "There, that is where he lies." And yet it does not matter, because he is not really there, and never was, any more than a man is truly in his gravestone. He is in the fading supper on the refectory wall in Milan, where the monks once ate. He is in the changing smile of the woman in the golden gloom. He is in the 10,000 pages of backward writing, in the water curling behind the stone, and the wing riding the air, and the child curled in the womb, and the whole world patiently, lovingly copied down. That is where he is, and there he cannot be lost, and there no war or ruin can disturb him, and the notebooks, the thousands of pages, the anatomy and the machines and the water and the flight of birds, were scattered, bought and sold, and separated across the courts and libraries of Europe, most of it unread, unpublished, unknown, for hundreds of years, so that the world had to slowly, painfully, over centuries, rediscover for itself nearly everything that this one man had already seen, alone, by candlelight, and written down backward, and locked away. And now that you know the shape of the whole life, first breath to last, let us go back to the beginning, gently, and walk through it more slowly, lingering in the rooms and the years, because the pleasure of a life like this is in the small things, and there is no hurry at all, and the lamp will burn as long as you need it to. There is a way of telling a great life that piles up the achievements like coins, this painting and that machine and the other discovery, until the man himself is buried under his own monument, and I do not want to tell it that way, because the wonder of Leonardo is not really the list of things he made, most of which are lost or ruined or were never built at all. The wonder of him is the quality of his attention, the way he looked at the world, and that is a thing you can carry off with you tonight and keep, long after the names of the dukes and the dates of the battles have blurred away. He looked at everything as if he had never seen it before and might never see it again, as if every ordinary thing were a letter in a language he was slowly learning to read, and he brought to a running stream or a bird's wing or an old man's face the same complete, patient, loving attention, and asked of each the same simple, bottomless question, how and why, and he never grew bored, and he never stopped, and the boredom that dulls the eyes of most grown people never once fell over his, so that he went to his grave at 67 still looking at the world with the fresh astonished eyes of the child under the bridge. So return with me to the Valley of Vinci in the spring of 1452 to the stone farmhouse and the terraced hills and the running water. Picture the world into which the child was born, because it was a world balanced on the very edge of the new. The old medieval order was passing, and the thing we call the Renaissance, the rebirth, was rising all around, a great reawakening of the mind of Europe to the lost learning of the ancient Greeks and Romans, to the beauty of the human body, to the pleasures and dignities of this life on this earth, rather than only the life to come. Money was pouring into Italy from trade with the whole known world, and with money came leisure, and with leisure came the wish for beauty, and men who had grown rich selling wool and lending gold now wanted their names carved on the fronts of churches and their faces painted on the walls of chapels. And so there was work, glorious work for anyone who could make beautiful things. The printing press had just been invented, far away in Germany, and books, which had always been rare and costly things copied slowly by hand, were about to become cheap and common, so that knowledge could spread as it never had before. And beneath all of it, in the workshops and the studios and the quiet studies, a new attitude was being born, the belief that a human being could figure things out, could measure and observe and reason and understand the world, rather than merely accepting what the ancient authorities had said. Into that hinge of history, that turning of the whole age, the child was born, and no one who has ever lived would embody the new spirit more completely. The marriage of the artist's eye and the scientist's question, then the illegitimate boy of Vinci. And it is worth saying plainly what that new spirit was, because it is the very thing that made him possible. For 1,000 years before him, learned men had believed that the truth about the world was already known, written down long ago by the ancient authorities, by the great Greek philosophers and the fathers of the Church, and that the task of a scholar was not to go and look at the world, but to read what the old books said about it, and to accept it. If the old books said the heart worked one way, or the stars moved another, or a stone fell for such and such a reason, then that was the truth, and to doubt it was pride. And the great slow revolution of Leonardo's age was the dawning idea that perhaps the old books were not always right, that perhaps a man could go and look for himself, could cut open the heart and see how it actually worked, could watch the stone actually fall, could trust his own eyes and his own hands and his own reason above the dead authority of the page. Leonardo, the unlettered man who could not read the old books anyway, took that idea further than anyone alive, made it the whole method of his life, wrote scornfully of the trumpeters and reciters of other men's works, who thought themselves wise for having memorized what dead men said, and called himself, proudly, a disciple of experience, a man who went to the thing itself. He was, in that sense, one of the first truly modern minds, one of the first to believe with his whole heart that the world could be understood by looking at it, and that is why, 500 years on, he feels so strangely like one of us. A man who would have been at home in any laboratory or workshop of our own day, asking the same eternal question, not what did the old books say. But how does it actually work? Let me look. Let me see for myself. His grandfather's little note, the one that recorded the hour of his birth, gives us the names of all those godparents, ordinary village people, a shoemaker's wife, a farmer, a woman from the next farm, and it is worth pausing on them, because they are the human warmth around the strange fact of his birth. A child born outside marriage could have been hidden away, given up, treated as a shame, and instead the whole village came to the font, and stood as godparents, and welcomed him, and this tells us that in his own small place he was not despised, but simply, quietly, held. His father Ser Piero would go on to a long and prosperous life, marrying 4 times as his wives died young in childbirth, one after another, and fathering in the end at least a dozen legitimate children, so that Leonardo, the firstborn, grew up to have a small crowd of half-brothers and half-sisters far younger than himself, most of them born when he was already a grown man, some of them younger than his own pupils. His relationship with his father seems to have been distant and correct rather than warm. A busy, ambitious notary and his odd, gifted natural son, and there is a strange telling silence around it. For in all those thousands of notebook pages, Leonardo almost never mentions his father, and when his father died, Leonardo wrote of it in the flattest, coldest possible way, noting the date and the hour twice over in a kind of numb repetition. The only crack in the surface being that he wrote it down at all, and wrote it wrong and wrote it again, as if the plain fact would not sit still on the page. And his mother, the peasant girl Caterina, drifts in and out of the story like a figure half seen through mist. She married after his birth a local man, a kiln worker with a rough nickname that suggests he was a quarrelsome sort, and she had other children by him, and lived her life out in the countryside. And yet there is a haunting late episode, when Leonardo was a grown famous man in Milan, in which a woman named Caterina came to live in his household, and grew ill, and died, and he recorded the expenses of her funeral with unusual care, the candles, the cost of the bier, the fee for the gravediggers, item by item, and many who study his life believe this was his mother, come to him at the end, and buried by her son, and that the careful list of funeral costs is the closest thing we have to the grief of a man who did not know how to write down grief, and so wrote down numbers instead. We cannot be certain. But the smile of the Mona Lisa has made people wonder, forever, about the mother he half remembered and half lost. The first mysterious woman, the first not quite readable face bending over the cradle in the stone farmhouse, and whether he spent his whole life, in some deep buried way, painting her. Let these things be soft and uncertain, as they truly are, and let us follow the boy forward into his apprentice years, into Florence, into the workshop, and let us live there a while, because those years shaped his hands and his eye. Remember the shape of a Florentine day for a boy like him. He would rise early, in a house full of other apprentices and journeymen, and the first tasks were humble and endless. The pigments that painters used were made from crushed stones and earths, and, for the precious blues, from a rare stone ground into powder, and grinding them fine on a slab of hard stone, with oil or egg, over and over, until the colour was smooth as silk, was the apprentice's daily labour, and Leonardo's hands must have been stained 100 colours and hardened by the stone. He learned to prepare the wooden panels, planing them smooth, coating them with layer after layer of a fine white ground, sanding each layer glass smooth, so that when the master came to paint there was a perfect luminous surface waiting. He learned to make brushes, tying the hairs of animals into quills. He learned the chemistry of oils and varnishes, which resins made the paint flow, which made it dry hard and shining, and this practical kitchen chemistry of the studio was, though he could not have known it, his first laboratory, the beginning of the endless experimenting that would both make and unmake so much of his work. And all the while he watched the master, watched Verrocchio model a figure in clay, cast a shape in bronze, cut a face into marble, solve the problem of how a heavy arm could be held out in bronze without the metal cracking under its own weight, and the boy who had come to learn painting was learning, without quite noticing, to think like an engineer, to ask always not only how a thing should look, but how it was made, and how it held together, and why. And he learned in that shop the deep slow chemistry of colour, which mattered to him more than to almost any painter before him. He learned that the glowing blue of a robe came from a stone carried by ship all the way from the far mountains of the east, more precious than gold, to be crushed and washed and purified into a powder so costly it was weighed out like jewels. He learned that reds came from the earth and from the crushed bodies of certain insects, and greens from copper and from crushed malachite, and blacks from burnt bone and from the soot of lamps, and that whites came from lead, and that each colour had its own nature, its own way of drying, its own quarrels with the others. And above all he learnt about oil, the new way of painting, brought down from the painters of the north, in which the colours were ground not into quick-drying egg, but into slow-drying oil, so that a painter could work wet into wet for hours and days, blending, softening, glazing one thin transparent layer of colour over another so that the light seemed to sink into the picture and glow back out. Of it from within, as if from a depth. And this, more than anything, was the tool that let him do the impossible soft thing he wanted to do, that let him build a face out of 100 breath-thin veils of shadow and light, and he seized upon it, and pushed it further than anyone, forever experimenting, forever mixing in some new resin or oil or method of his own devising. And this restless chemistry of the studio was both the making of his beauty and, in The Last Supper and The Great Lost Battle, the ruin of his work, the same bold experimenting hand that gave his pictures their unearthly glow also, sometimes mixing the very poison that made them fall from the wall. There is a drawing that survives from these years, or near them, the earliest dated work we have from his hand, a quick pen sketch of the Arno Valley, the very landscape of his boyhood, drawn from high on a hillside, the river winding away below through the misty distance, and he wrote a little date on it in his mirror hand, a day in early August. And there is something wonderful in the fact that the first surviving thing from the greatest visual mind in history is not a person or a saint or a grand design, but simply a valley, the land itself, drawn for the pure joy of getting down how the light lay across the far hills, and how the water threaded the plain, the boy from the country drawing the country, already in love with the world as it actually is. As he grew into a young master, he grew also into the fullness of his charm and his strangeness, and the accounts of him from these years, though written down later, paint a vivid picture. He dressed beautifully, even flamboyantly. In an age of sober colours, he wore short rose-coloured tunics when others wore long dark robes, and he kept himself clean and elegant and perfumed, and his beard and his long fair hair were always well tended. He was, they said, wonderful company, generous, gracious, funny, a marvellous teller of stories and riddles, a fine singer who could improvise verses to his own, playing on a strange silver lyre he had made himself, shaped, some said, like a horse's skull, to give it a deeper sound. He was a musician of real gifts, and it was partly as a musician that he first came to the court of Milan, sent, some say, to carry a marvellous instrument as a gift. A lyre he had made himself out of silver, shaped strangely, some accounts say, like the skull of a horse, so that it gave a fuller and stranger and more carrying tone than the ordinary wooden ones, and he played it beautifully and sang to it, improvising verses on the spot, so that he could sit in a hall of nobles and make up a song about whatever was before him, and by every account he outshone every trained musician there, and won the room not with a painting, but with his voice and his silver horse skull lyre. Imagine that. The greatest painter and scientist of the age walking into a duke's court as a singer, charming a hall of jaded aristocrats with a song he was making up as he went, and you begin to see how completely he refused to be one thing, how the same hands that would dissect a corpse and design a cannon and paint a smile could also, of an evening, coax a tune out of silver and hold a whole court still. He loved animals with a tenderness rare in that hard age, and there is a lovely story, believed by many, that he would sometimes go to the markets where songbirds were sold in little cages, and buy them, all of them, and open the cages and let them fly free, purely for the joy of watching them rise into the sky, a man who studied the flight of birds by giving birds back their flight. Some say he ate no meat at all, that he could not bear to be the cause of an animal's suffering and death, which would have made him a great rarity in his century, and though we cannot be certain, it fits everything else we know of him, the gentleness under the genius, the reverence for living things that ran alongside his cold nighttime work with the knife and the dead. He was a bundle of such contradictions, and that is part of why he fascinates, the man who designed the machines of war and set the caged birds free, who opened the bodies of the dead and could not bear to kill a bird, who charmed every court in Italy and let almost no one truly in, who could do anything and finished almost nothing. And around him, through all the wandering years, there gathered a small faithful household, a little travelling family of his own making, since he never made the ordinary kind. There were the pupils, the young men who came to learn from him, and stayed for love of him, and beside the beautiful, maddening little devil who had been with him since boyhood, there came in the later years another young man of good family, gentle and devoted, who became his true right hand, who kept his papers and managed his affairs, and stood by him faithfully to the very end and beyond it, guarding the precious notebooks as a sacred trust after the master was gone. Leonardo drew these young men, and taught them, and quarrelled with them, and forgave them, and paid their debts, and there is in his notebooks, amid the geometry and the anatomy, the ordinary tender bookkeeping of a man caring for a household. So much for a cloak for one of them, so much for shoes, so much lent and not repaid and written down anyway with a sigh. The record of a solitary man who had, in his own strange way, made himself a family out of apprentices and servants, and one incorrigible beloved thief, and carried them with him from city to city, feeding them and clothing them and teaching them, so that he was never in the end quite as alone as the guarded surface of him suggested. Now let us return to Milan, and live more slowly in those 17 years, because they were the great middle of his life. Picture the city as he first saw it, riding in from the south around the age of 30, his lyre and his notebooks, and his letter of application in his baggage. Milan was larger than Florence, a city of over 100,000 people, grey and industrious, a place of armourers, for the finest armour in Europe was made in Milan, and of soldiers and merchants, ruled from a huge brooding brick castle by the Sforza family. It was less refined than Florence, less drunk on poetry and philosophy, more practical, more warlike, and in some ways it suited Leonardo better, because here he was not one clever painter among 100 clever painters, but the great exotic import, the Florentine wonder, and he could be everything at once, engineer and artist and musician and master of revels, and no one told him to stay in his lane, because he had no lane. Ludovico Sforza, his patron, was a complicated man to serve, magnificent and treacherous, generous and unreliable, forever short of money despite his splendour, because he spent it faster than any treasury could hold. So that Leonardo's wages were often late, and he sometimes had to write careful, wounded, dignified letters to the Duke, reminding him that he had not been paid, and that his household of pupils and servants must eat. But the Duke loved beautiful things and clever things, and Leonardo could give him both, and so a strange kind of friendship of use grew up between the warlord and the genius. And the genius stayed. In Milan he set up a proper household of his own, with pupils and apprentices and servants, and became a master with a workshop just as Verrocchio had been. And here into that household came the boy who would be the great domestic fact of the rest of his life. He was a local boy of about 10 years old, of surpassing beauty. With the curling golden hair Leonardo loved to paint, and he was, from the very first day, a holy terror. Leonardo, who wrote down everything, wrote down the boy's crimes with a kind of exasperated affection that is one of the most human things in all his notebooks. On the second day, he wrote, "I had 2 shirts cut out for him, and he stole the money meant to pay for them. He is a thief," Leonardo wrote, "and a liar, and obstinate, and a glutton." And then, having called the child every hard name, he kept him, and clothed him, and fed him, and taught him, and put up with the stealing and the lying for the next 25 years, until the end of his own life, because he loved him, and gave him the nickname that stuck to the boy forever. A name that means little devil, or the little unclean one, and that is how history knows him still. It tells you something tender and stubborn about Leonardo, that the most careful, exacting, perfectionist mind of the age chose to spend his life beside a beautiful, maddening thief he could never reform and never wanted to send away, as if this cold, precise man needed one warm, chaotic human thing near him that he could not measure or control or perfect, and simply had to love as it was. And there is a lesson buried in it about the whole shape of his heart, because Leonardo, who could not finish a painting, who abandoned masterpiece after masterpiece the moment it grew imperfect in his eyes, who could not bear to let a picture be less than the vision in his mind, was somehow able to keep, for a quarter of a century, a human being who was a walking imperfection. a thief and a liar and a glutton, and to love him not despite the flaws, but simply as he was, whole and unmended. It is as if all the patience he could not give to his own work he gave, instead to this one difficult boy. As if a person, unlike a painting, did not have to be finished or perfect to be kept and loved. And one likes to think that the little devil, for all his stealing, gave the great solitary man something no picture ever could. A warm, loud, exasperating, unimprovable proof that he was not alone in the world, and that some things are meant to be loved rather than completed. In Milan the notebooks truly began to swell, and it is worth sitting a while with these notebooks, because they are the real Leonardo, more than any painting. Imagine the room where he worked at night, the shutters closed, a lamp or a cluster of candles burning. The great man bent over a page, the world quiet outside. He wrote from right to left in that mirror hand, partly because he was left-handed and it kept his hand from smudging the wet ink, and partly, one suspects, because he simply liked the privacy of it, the way it turned his thought into a thing that only patient effort could read. There is something wonderful and a little sad in that mirror writing when you think about it, this vast treasury of discovery set down in a form that faced away from the world, that had to be held up to a glass to be read, as if the man were forever talking to himself, thinking aloud onto the page for his own eyes only, and never quite meaning, or never quite managing, to turn the writing around and hand it to anyone else. He meant to, always, again and again in the notebooks he writes little notes to himself about the books he will make of all this, the treatise on water, the treatise on the human body, the treatise on painting, and he even lays out how they will be arranged, and it never happens. The raw material piles higher and higher, and is never built into the finished thing, exactly as the horse was never cast and the supper was never made permanent, so that his greatest work of all, the record of that incomparable mind, remained, like everything else, a magnificent unfinished heap, 1,000 beginnings, and the writing stayed turned inward, facing the mirror, waiting for a reader who would not come for hundreds of years. And onto the pages went everything, with no order at all. A page might begin with a careful geometric proof, drift into a design for a canal lock, then a sketch of an old man's profile with a hooked nose, then a list of books he wanted to buy, then a sudden question. Why is the sky blue? Then a recipe, then a drawing of the muscles of a leg, then a riddle, then a note to himself. Learn the multiplication of roots from Master So-and-so. Tell me if the tower at such-and-such was ever finished. Ask the merchant from Flanders how they walk on ice in his country. Get a skull. Describe the tongue of the woodpecker. That last one is famous. Describe the tongue of the woodpecker. Tucked into a list of chores, and it is the whole man in 5 words, the boundless, aimless, holy curiosity that had to know how the tongue of a woodpecker worked, simply because it existed and he did not yet understand it, and the world was full, endlessly full, of such small unopened miracles, and there would never ever be time enough to open them all. And that ache, that sweet unbearable sense of a world too rich to ever finish learning, is perhaps the truest feeling of his whole life. And scattered through these same pages, between the machines and the anatomy and the questions, are the little jokes and fables he wrote for his own amusement, gentle small stories in which a stone longs to leave its quiet hillside and join the bright pebbles down on the road, and is duly carried down, and then lies there in the dust and the dung being ground under cartwheels and hooves, and forever wishing it had stayed where it was, in peace, up on the green hill. Small parables of the folly of wanting more than you have, told by a man who could never stop wanting to know more than he knew. And there are his riddles, his prophecies as he called them, clever little puzzles he would pose at court, describing some ordinary thing in such dark and terrible language that his listeners thought he was foretelling the end of the world, and then revealing, with a smile, that he had only been describing, say, the writing of a letter, or the slether of a shoe, or the cutting of an onion. He liked to tease, to surprise, to make the familiar strange and then familiar again, and you can feel, reading these fragments, how good his company must have been, this beautiful, courteous man who could talk of the stars and then make you laugh at a riddle about a shoe, and who carried, under all the charm, a mind that never once stopped turning over the machinery of the whole created world. He studied water above all things, water in every form and motion, and he meant to write a whole book about it, and he watched it fall and swirl and rise as steam and freeze and flow, and he saw, long before anyone, that the water of the world moves in a great circle, up into the clouds and down as rain, and along the rivers to the sea, and up again, the same water forever, and he compared it, in a leap of imagination that takes the breath away, to the blood of the earth, moving through the body of the world as blood moves through the body of a man, and he saw the streams as veins and the tides as a kind of breathing, one living system, the whole planet a single body, an idea so far ahead of his age that it has a modern ring to it even now. He designed canals to move the water and mills to harness it, and locks to lift boats up and down the hills, and some of his canal designs in and around Milan were actually studied and used, so that here and there in his life a real thing was built from his drawings, and served real people, moving barges and grinding grain, one of the rare times the dreaming turned into something you could touch. He filled a whole notebook, near the end, with nothing but the flight of birds, and it is one of the most beautiful things he ever made, page after page of a mind trying to catch something as quick and free as a bird upon the wind and pin it down in ink. He saw that a bird does not simply flap to stay up, that most of the work is done by the air itself, that a bird with spread wings rests upon the moving air the way a swimmer rests upon the sea, and that the great birds, the ones that circle for hours without a single beat of the wing, are riding the rising currents of warm air, letting the invisible fountains of the sky lift them, spending almost no effort at all, and this is exactly, precisely, how the men of our own age at last learned to fly without engines, in gliders, riding the very currents he had drawn, so that a boy in a modern glider soaring silent above a summer field is doing the thing that Leonardo watched the hawks do over Monte Albano, and understood, alone, 500 years too soon. And he studied flight, endlessly, the great impossible dream, filling page after page with birds, how the wing beats, how it catches the air on the downstroke and slips through it on the up, how the bird uses the wind rather than fighting it, how it balances and turns and dives. And from all this watching he designed his flying machines, great bat-winged and bird-winged contraptions with harnesses and levers and stirrups, a man lying in the frame working the wings with his arms and legs, and he never grasped, quite, the one fatal fact, that a man's muscles are simply too weak, and a man's body too heavy, for flapping wings to ever lift him, so that not one of the machines could ever have flown, and yet the studies of the flight itself, of how the air holds a wing, were so true that they belong less to his century than to the 20th, when at last men learned to ride the same rising air in gliders and understood that Leonardo, dreaming in his Milan lamplight, had already seen how it was done. He even designed on one small page a strange spiral like a great screw meant to bore up into the air and lift a craft straight off the ground. And though it too could never have worked, people ever since have looked at it and seen, or imagined they saw, the far-off ancestor of the helicopter, the man from Vinci sketching the future on the back of a page of grocery lists. And he designed a pyramid of stiffened cloth, a great tent to be worn falling from a height, and wrote beside it that with this a man might throw himself down from any great height without hurt, the plain first description of a parachute, and in our own age people have made one exactly to his drawing and jumped from aircraft and floated safely down, so that a thing dreamed in 1400 and something worked perfectly the first time it was ever built, 400 years after the dreamer was dust. Let all of that settle in your mind, the sheer overflowing abundance of it, and remember that he showed almost none of it to anyone, that it was a private universe, a second secret life running underneath the visible life of the court painter and pageant master, and that when he died it all went into a chest, and was scattered and lost and only slowly found again, so that the man himself never knew, could never know, that he had been right about so much that the future would prove him true, that his lonely nighttime questions had real answers, and he had guessed so many of them in the dark. And now let us come to the two great works of those Milan years, and sit before each in turn, slowly, the way he would have wanted, since he could sit before his own work for hours without a stroke. First the horse, the great bronze horse that was never cast. Understand what it meant to him, because horses were, after human beings, the creatures he loved and studied most. He kept horses, fine ones, and spent freely on them, and drew them ceaselessly. The great arch of the neck, the play of the muscles under the glossy hide, the proud small head, the way a horse rears and paws and tosses its mane, and he went to the Duke's stables and measured the finest stallions point by point, seeking the perfect proportions, the ideal horse that existed in no single animal but could be assembled from the best of many. And on that ideal he meant to build a monument such as the world had not seen since the ancient Romans. A bronze horse over 20 feet high, 3 times life-size, with the Duke's warrior father mounted upon it, an image of power and dynasty to stand forever in Milan. He went first to the Duke's stables, the finest in Italy, and he chose out the most beautiful of the war horses and the parade horses, and he measured each one, patiently, point by point, the length of the head, the arch of the neck, the depth of the chest, the set of the legs, writing it all down in his notebooks with the names of the horses and their owners, because he was not trying to copy any one horse, but to distill from all of them the perfect horse that lived in none of them, the ideal that the real ones only pointed toward. And there is something moving in the thought of the great man wandering the warm, dim stables, among the huge, gentle animals he loved above all other creatures, running his hands along their flanks, measuring, comparing, murmuring to them, gathering the raw material of a beauty larger than life. He laboured over it for years, and solved at last in his own mind the crushing technical problems. How to make so vast a mould, how to pour so much bronze at once, how to keep the colossal thing from breaking under its own weight, and he built the full-sized model in clay, and it stood in a courtyard of the castle, gleaming and enormous, and all Milan came to marvel at it, and the poets wrote verses saying that the ancients were surpassed at last, that nothing so great had ever been made. And then the metal that was to give it eternal life was carried off to be cast into cannon against the coming French, and the war swept in, and the model stood abandoned, and the invading soldiers used it for target practice, and the rain came, and the greatest sculpture never made melted slowly back into the mud of the courtyard where it had stood, and years later Leonardo, wandering, exiled, would write in his notebook a few desolate words about the horse, and then fall silent, because there are losses a man cannot make many words about. Now cross the city to the quiet refectory of the convent of Santa Maria degli Grazi, and stand where the monks stood, and look at the wall where he painted the Last Supper, and let us understand what he did there. Slowly the room was long, with tables down the sides where the brothers ate in silence, while one of them read aloud from a holy book, and at the far end Leonardo painted his supper so that it seemed to open the wall into another room. The very room the monks sat in, continued, with Christ and his 12 companions at a long table along the far side. The light in the painted room falling from the same direction as the real windows, so that Christ seemed to share the monks' own meal, their own quiet room, their own daily bread. And the prior of the convent, so the story goes, grew impatient with how slowly the work went, and complained to the Duke that the painter dawdled, that he would stand for half a day with his arms folded and not lift a brush, and the Duke gently put the complaint to Leonardo, who answered, patiently, that men of genius are sometimes working hardest when they seem to be doing the least, because they are turning the invention over in their minds and perfecting it before ever the hand moves. And then he added, with the faintest edge of a joke, that he still lacked one face, the face of the betrayer, and that if the good prior grew any more impatient, why, he might just use the prior's own head for it, at which the Duke laughed, and the prior troubled him no more. It is a small, perfect glimpse of the man, the slowness that was not idleness but thought, the courtesy with the quiet blade of wit inside it, the refusal to be hurried by any prior or any duke or any deadline in all the world, because the picture in his mind moved at its own pace, and no other. And into that calm illusion he put the storm, the moment after the terrible sentence, "One of you shall betray me," and he had thought about that moment for years, filling notebooks with faces, going out into the streets of Milan to find the right heads, the right hands, following a man across the city because his face held some quality he needed, and he built the picture as a study of how 12 different souls receive one unbearable piece of news, so that it is really a painting about the inside of the human mind, about how we each meet fear and doubt and grief according to our own nature, one leaning in to ask who, one drawing back in horror, one spreading his hands to plead his innocence, one, the guilty one, clutching his little bag of silver and knocking over the salt, his face falling into shadow. All of it wheeling around the still calm accepting centre where Christ sits with his hands open on the table and his eyes lowered, alone in the middle of the storm he has raised, the one point of peace in a room breaking apart. It was unlike anything painted before, and painters came from everywhere to study it, and it changed forever how the scene would be shown, and it began to fall off the wall almost at once, because of his fatal need to work slowly in the wrong materials, and it has been dying for 500 years, and we love the ghost of it, and perhaps a ghost is the right form for it, a thing forever half vanishing, a supper forever fading, a masterpiece that teaches, in its very ruin, that nothing here is permanent, not even the greatest things we make. And then Milan fell, and the 17 years ended, and Leonardo, nearly 50, took his notebooks and his pupils and his beautiful thieving little devil, and went out onto the roads again, back toward Florence, into the strange restless final third of his life, and it is here, in these wandering later years, that he painted the smiling woman he would never let go, and opened the bodies of the dead, and quarrelled silently with the young furious Michelangelo, and drank at last, at the very end, in a green French valley, the peace of a king's affection. Let us walk that last stretch slowly too, and gently, because it winds toward the lamp going out. Back in Florence, the city of his youth, he found himself a celebrity and something of a curiosity. The great old master returned, and he took on grand commissions and, in his way, finished almost none of them. In these Florence years he made another picture too, or the beginnings of one, that many people love above all the rest, a drawing and then a painting of the Virgin seated on the lap of her own mother, St. Anne, with the child reaching down toward a lamb, 3 generations and a small animal woven into a single gentle pyramid of intertwined bodies and glances and half-smiles. The older woman gazing down at the younger with a tenderness that seems to hold the whole mystery of mothers and daughters and the passing of love down the generations, and the young mother reaching for her child, and the child reaching for the lamb, a chain of reaching love from the oldest to the youngest, all of it wrapped in that soft dissolving light, and it is, of everything he made, perhaps the most purely warm, the most human, as if the childless man who half remembered a lost mother had poured into it everything he knew and everything he longed to know about the gentleness that passes between a mother and her child. He was set, as we heard, against young Michelangelo, each to paint a wall of the great council hall, and the whole city thrilled at the contest. And Leonardo designed his terrible beautiful battle, the knot of screaming horses and raging men fighting for a standard, the maddened faces of horse and rider blurring into one bestial thing, the gentlest of men pouring all his knowledge into an image of the ugliness of war. And once more his experiment with the paint failed, the colours ran, and the wall was abandoned. And the 2 great battle pictures that all Florence had waited for, his and Michelangelo's both, were each in their own way never truly finished, and both lost, and survive only in copies and fragments and the memory of the age. The greatest contest in the history of art ending, absurdly, wonderfully, in 2 magnificent failures. But in the same years he took up the small panel of the merchant's wife, and here at least he did not fail, though he also never let it be finished or delivered, because to finish it would have been to end it, and he could not bear to. Think of what he did on that little piece of wood. He built the face out of dozens of layers of paint so thin they were almost breath, glazing shadow over shadow. softening every edge into that smoky dusk he had loved since boyhood, until there were no lines anywhere, only the gentle emergence of a living face out of a golden gloom, the corners of the mouth and the corners of the eyes left deliberately soft and unresolved, so that the smile is never fixed, seems to gather and fade as you look. Warm one moment and grave the next, present and withdrawing, exactly as a real beloved face shifts and eludes us in life. And behind her he painted a strange dream of a landscape, winding roads and a bridge and misty blue peaks and threads of water, the whole watery misty world he had studied all his life, so that the woman sits before the very elements of his obsession, water and mist and distance and light, as if she were the calm human centre of his entire universe, the still point at the middle of all that moving water, the way Christ was the still point at the middle of the storm. He carried her with him everywhere for the rest of his life, and never gave her up, and that is why she is in France today, and not in Florence, because she went where he went. The young woman's changing smile riding in the old man's baggage over the Alps, and there is no more tender image in the whole story than that. People have asked forever why he could never finish her, never hand her over, never take the merchant's money and be done. And perhaps the answer is simply that she was not, in the end, a commission at all, but a private companion. A thing he was making for no one, a place where he could keep on doing forever the one thing he loved most, which was to look at a human face and try to understand it, and that as long as the picture was unfinished the looking could continue, and to call it finished would be to admit that he had understood her completely, which he never would, which no one ever does, which is the whole quiet heartbreak and the whole quiet consolation of loving another person. So he kept her unfinished, and kept her near, and went on softening a shadow here, and warming a tone there for year after year, decade after decade, and the more he worked the more alive and the more unreadable she became, until she was less a portrait of one silk merchant's young wife than a portrait of the mystery of consciousness itself. The fact that behind every ordinary face there is a whole hidden universe we can love and study and never fully enter, and that is why the world has never been able to stop looking at her. Because he painted, better than anyone before or since, the thing we most want and can never quite have, which is to truly see inside another soul. And through these same years, deeper and darker, ran the anatomy, the nights with the dead. He had permission at a great hospital in Florence, where the old and the poor came to die, and he would sit with a dying old man, talk with him gently, and then, when the man had died, quietly, of nothing but age, Leonardo would open his body to learn how it had lived, and he drew what he found. The frame of the bones, the ropes of the muscles laid bare layer by layer, the branching rivers of the blood, and he did it, by his own account, alone, at night, through fear and disgust, because the only way to know the truth of the body was to look at it with his own eyes, and he trusted his eyes above every book. There is one dissection that he wrote about at length, and it is the most human and moving of them all. In the hospital at Florence he had come to know an old man, very old, over 100 years the old fellow claimed, and the two of them would talk, and the old man told Leonardo that he felt nothing wrong with him at all, only a growing weakness. And then one day, sitting quietly on his bed, with no pain and no struggle, the old man simply passed out of this life, gently, like a lamp burning down to nothing, and Leonardo, who had sat with him and talked with him, then opened his body, to learn, as he wrote, the cause of so sweet a death, and he found the answer, that the vessels carrying the blood had grown narrow and hard and choked with age, so that the old man had died in effect, of the slow quiet closing of his own rivers. It is one of the first clear descriptions in all of history of the hardening of the arteries, written by an artist alone at night, and what stays with you is not only the accuracy, but the tenderness. The phrase "a sweet death," the sense of a man who had befriended the living person, and then, with sorrow and with wonder and with that unquenchable need to understand, looked inside to see how the friendship had ended, and found there not horror but a kind of gentle mechanical truth, that we are made of channels and pumps and threads, and that they wear, and slow and still. And that this too is part of the beautiful order of things. He drew the human heart as no one had, its 4 chambers, its valves, and worked out correctly things about how blood flows and how the valves close that would not be understood again for centuries. He drew the unborn child curled in the opened womb, and around that drawing he wrote with wonder and tenderness, this old solitary childless man, marvelling at the beginning of a life, at the soul, as he thought of it, waiting in the small perfect body, and there is something almost holy in it. The man who set caged birds free, bending over the deepest mystery of all with his careful pen, trying, in the only way he knew, which was to look and to draw, to understand where we come from, and think what it cost him, in that age, to do this work at all, because there was no cold science to hide behind, no clean bright room, only a dead body in the dark, and the smell of it, and the slow spoiling, and the fear of the church, and the fear of the crowd who thought such work unholy, and his own natural human horror, which he confessed, writing that even a man drawn on by the noblest curiosity might be turned back by the disgust of spending the night, hours in the company of corpses cut and flayed and fearful to behold. And still he went on, night after night, year after year, holding down the horror with the sheer force of his need to know. Because to him the body was not a horror at all, but a marvel, the most exquisite machine in all creation, and to look upon its hidden workings, the way the joints hinged and the muscles pulled and the blood ran and the child grew, was to look upon the very handwriting of whatever power had made the world. And that, for Leonardo, was a form of worship deeper than any he could have found in a church. The worship of a man who believed that to understand a thing truly and completely was the highest love that a thing could be given. He meant always to gather it into a great book, to give the world this knowledge, and always something pulled him away, a new commission, a new city, a new question, and the drawings piled up unpublished, and when he died they scattered like all the rest, and the makers of medicine had to grope their way for centuries more toward truths this one man had already drawn, and locked in a chest, and left to the dark. There is a drawing, made somewhere in these later years, that many people believe to be his own face, a portrait of an old man in red chalk, with long flowing hair and a long flowing beard and heavy shadowed brows, and beneath the brows a pair of eyes of extraordinary depth and patience and sorrow, eyes that seem to have looked at everything the world contains and to be looking still. Past the paper, at something far off, whether it is truly his own face or the face of some other grand old man he studied, it has become, for all of us who came after, the face of Leonardo, the very image of the wise old sage. And it is worth holding in your mind as we come to the end, this bearded elder with the ancient tired all-seeing eyes, because that is the man who now made his last long journey. Then the last move, the last kindness of his life. The young king of France, Francis, huge and generous and dazzled by Italy and by this old wizard of a man, wanted Leonardo simply to have him near, and gave him the manor of Clou in the soft green valley of the Loire, and a good pension, and asked almost nothing in return but his talk. And Leonardo, old and tired and honoured, crossed the Alps one last time on a mule, carrying the notebooks and the paintings he loved, and came to rest. Picture that last crossing of the mountains, an old man, perhaps 64 years old, in an age when 60 was ancient, jogging slowly on muleback up the winding passes and down into a foreign country, his faithful pupils riding beside him. The baggage mules behind loaded with the wrapped panels and the great bound bundles of notebooks, thousands of pages of a lifetime's looking, and among the panels, wrapped most carefully of all, the smiling woman. Going where he went, over the snow line and down into France. He did not speak the language. He was leaving Italy, the only world he had ever known, the light and the hills and the tongue of his boyhood, and he must have known he was leaving it for good, that he would not come back over these mountains, and yet he went, toward a king who wanted nothing from him but himself, and found at the end of the hard road not exile, but home. Picture the last 3 years. A comfortable stone manor house with a garden and a little stream. Near the king's great castle, and the young king, who could have been drunk on his own power and glory, coming often and humbly to sit with the old man and listen, hour after hour, to whatever he wished to speak of, the movement of water, the anatomy of the heart, the flight of birds, the nature of light, the building of cities, the painting of a smile. And the king saying afterward that no man had ever been born who knew so much, and that the world would be poorer without him, which was as true a thing as any king ever said. Picture the daily round of it, the quiet, dignified evening of so stormy a life. The old man would rise and walk in his garden among the flowers he had always loved to study, and the light would come soft and grey and green over the Loire, in a way not so very different from the light over the Arno of his boyhood, water and mist and low hills, as if the world had brought him gently back at the end to the kind of place where he began. His pupils were about him, and there was good food, and there was wine, and there was rest, and there was, above all respect, the unhurried honouring of an old man by a young king who understood that what he had in his household was not a servant but a wonder. And still the mind would not stop, even now, even with the right hand weak and the body failing. And he went on drawing, and thinking, and organising his oceans of paper, and dreaming up one last great pageant to delight his king, and even in France, so the story goes, he built again a marvel like the mechanical lion of his youth, a walking lion that opened to shower down the royal flowers, so that the very last public wonder of his life rhymed with the wonders of his prime, the old master, at the end, doing once more the beautiful vanishing thing he had done at the very start of his fame, making magic for a single evening out of gears and cloth and genius, and then letting it go. Leonardo's right hand had weakened, and he could not paint as he had, and so he ordered his mountains of notes, and drew, and thought, and designed one last great festival to please his king, and near the end he drew those strange dark visions of the end of the world, immense floods and storms, whole cities dissolving under falling water, the earth returning to the sea it had risen from, whether out of some final dread, or only out of his lifelong love of the way water moves, no one can ever say, but it is a solemn thing to know that the last great images from the greatest eye in history were of the whole world quietly dissolving away in water, calm and terrible, like a man watching, without fear, the tide come in over everything he had ever known. He fell ill in the spring, and made his will, careful and generous to the end, remembering his pupils and his servants and his difficult beloved little devil, leaving the priceless notebooks to his most faithful follower, arranging every candle and every mass for his own funeral with the same attention he had brought to the muscles of a horse and the smile of a woman, an old man tidying the last details of a life, unafraid, wanting only to leave things in good order. And on the 2nd day of May, in the year 1519, in the manor of Clou, in the valley of the Loire, in France, far from the stone farmhouse and the terraced olives of Vinci where he had first opened his eyes 67 years before, Leonardo died, and the legend, false but true, says the great king held his head as he went, and he was carried to the church of the castle at Amboise and buried, and in the wars and ruins of later centuries his grave was disturbed and his very bones were lost, so that no one can say today which dust in that ground was the mind that held the world. But the story does not quite end in the dark, and I do not want to leave you in the dark, because the wonderful thing, the consoling thing, is what happened afterward, slowly, over centuries. The faithful pupil who inherited the notebooks carried them home to Italy and kept them like relics, all those thousands of pages, and meant perhaps to make from them the great books Leonardo never finished, the book on painting, the book on water, the book on the body of man, and never quite managed it, because it was the work of a lifetime, and he had only his own life to live. And when he in turn died, the great hoard began to break apart, sold and split and scattered across the centuries. Sheets carried off to France and Spain and England, bound into odd volumes, hidden in libraries, forgotten in the bottoms of chests, some of it surely lost forever, burned or crumbled or thrown away by people who did not know what they held. And so the strange slow drama of the notebooks began, a treasure buried not all at once but grain by grain across the whole of Europe, waiting. The notebooks that scattered were, one by one, gathered up again by careful hands, kings and collectors and scholars, and bound and studied, and the world began gradually to understand what had been lost and found, that this man, alone, in the lamplight, had seen how water circles the earth, and how the heart pumps the blood, and how a wing holds the air, and how a face truly appears to the eye, and how the mountains had once been under the sea, and 100 other truths that his own age had no way even to test. And so he wins in the end the strange slow victory of a man too early for his world, because the future, arriving at last, opened his notebooks and found itself already described, and every generation since has stood before the fading supper and the unfading smile and the pages of backward writing, and felt the same thing, wonder, plain wonder, that one human being, born by chance to a peasant girl in a Tuscan spring, unschooled, illegitimate, free, could have loved the world so much, and looked at it so hard, and understood so deeply that the looking never has to end. And here is the last quiet thing, the thing worth carrying down into the dark with you. He left almost nothing finished. The great horse melted back into the mud. The great supper began flaking from the wall almost before the plaster was dry. The great battle ran and blurred and was painted over and lost. The flying machines never flew. The ideal city was never built. The books on water and the body and painting were never written. The notebooks were scattered to the winds. Of all the vast labour of that vast mind, only a handful of small pictures came whole through the centuries, and even the most famous of them he never finished, never delivered, only carried about with him to the end. By the accounting of the world, it should have been a life of failure, a career of magnificent ruins, and yet no one who has ever looked at what he left has felt anything but awe, because we understand, looking at it, that the finishing was never the point, that the real work, the true masterpiece, was the looking itself, the questions themselves, the 10,000 pages of a man simply paying attention to the world with everything he had, and that this, and not any bronze or any wall, was the thing of lasting value, the thing time could not melt or flake or scatter. So let that be the thought you carry down into sleep tonight, the gentlest thought this life has to give, that curiosity is a kind of love, that to look closely and patiently at an ordinary thing, a stream, a leaf, a face, is to honour it, and that a life spent asking how the world works, even a life full of unfinished things, and lost horses and fading walls, is not a failure, but one of the most beautiful ways a human being can spend the brief bright while that is given to us. He would tell you, I think, that there is no hurry, that the thing itself is enough, that you may leave the picture unfinished, and it is still yours, still true, still worth the loving. He spent his whole life leaving things unfinished, and the world loves him no less for it, perhaps loves him more, because in his beautiful ruins and his scattered pages we recognise ourselves, we who also never finish, who also leave so much undone, who also carry about with us the unfinished picture of the people we love and never fully understand. And if the greatest mind that ever lived could go to his rest, with the horse unmade, and the books unwritten, and the smile unfinished, and be, at the end, at peace, held in the arms of a king, then perhaps we too may be gentle with ourselves, and lay down our own unfinished work at the end of the day, and rest. The lamp is low now, and the room is warm, and there is nowhere you need to be. If these lamplit lives have kept you company tonight, and if a life told slowly and kindly helps you rest, stay with us, and another one will always be waiting when you return, some other soul from long ago, carried out of the dark and into the warm light of the lamp, first breath to last, at the pace of your own quiet breathing. But that is for another night. For now, only rest. The valley of Vinci is green in the spring rain, and the water is running down from the mountain the way it always has, and somewhere a golden-haired boy is lying in the grass, watching a bird hold itself still upon the wind, in no hurry at all, with his whole long extraordinary life still ahead of him. And the light is soft and low over the olive trees, and everything is quiet, and everything is well. Sleep now. The lamp will keep its small warm watch a little longer, and then it too will gently go out, and the stars will come out over the hills of Tuscany and the hills of France alike. The same stars he looked up at and wondered over, and you may drift beneath them, easy and unhurried, into the deep kind country of sleep. Good night. Rest well. He is still there, in the lamplight, patient and gentle, and so for as long as you need it are we.